My name is Alisia. I am 23 years old, but sometimes when I look back on my journey, it feels as if I have lived 100 years in a short span of time. This is my story. One born in a quiet town in India, beneath skies filled with monsoon clouds and summers that smelled of jasmine and dust. When I was a little girl, America was not just a place on a map. It was a dream stitched together by photographs and stories. In the pages of magazines, I saw a world that glowed. Tall glass buildings that reached into the heavens, streets wide and clean, people
Paradise.
dressed with effortless style, their smiles bright and easy. At night, those cities seemed alive with neon, as though every street corner promised a secret adventure. My neighbors, my teachers, even my relatives, all said the same words that echoed like a prophecy. America is a land of dreams. Go there and your life will be perfect. And I believed it. I believed with all the innocence and certainty of youth. I remember lying on the rooftop of our modest home during warm summer nights. The stars above shimmered like diamonds scattered across velvet. I would close my eyes and see myself walking down the bustling streets of New York. In my imagination, I wore a smart dress that swayed with the wind, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, a handbag tucked under my arm. I dreamed of an apartment with large windows that framed the city lights, of college lectures in the day and evenings filled with laughter among friends from every corner of the globe. Back then, I thought America had no sorrow, no hardship, no hunger. In my mind, it was a place where every person was wealthy, every soul was content, every dream was already waiting at the doorstep. Poverty, illness, loneliness, those belonged to other lands, never to the land of liberty. So I worked with that image in my heart. I studied English relentlessly. While others drifted to sleep under the hum of ceiling fans, I stayed up with borrowed books, tracing the lines of foreign words, tasting their sounds, training my tongue. Some nights, my eyelids trembled with exhaustion, yet the vision of that shining city kept me awake. And one day, the impossible happened. A piece of paper changed everything. My student visa to New York arrived. The morning I left home, the air was heavy with both joy and grief. My mother's arms wrapped around me tightly, as though she could shield me from 1,000 unseen dangers. Her tears wet my shoulder as she whispered, "Take care of yourself, dear. Promise me." My father, a man of few words, pressed a small packet into my hand. "Open this only when you feel lonely," he said. His eyes, usually stern, softened for a fleeting second. I carried their hopes like a sacred bundle in my chest. "I'll be fine. I'll make you proud," I told them, with a courage I wasn't sure I truly had. When the airplane wheels touched American soil, my heart pounded so fiercely it felt as though everyone could hear it. The airport was a city in itself, vast, buzzing with voices and footsteps. The air was crisp, cold, and unfamiliar. English poured from every corner, fast and unrelenting. I stepped outside, and the taxi ride became my first glimpse of the world I had imagined. Towering skyscrapers scraped the sky. Billboards flashed with relentless light. People hurried across streets with a sense of purpose I had never known. My chest swelled. I whispered silently, "This is it. My new life begins now." And at first, everything was magical, almost too perfect. The streets overflowed with color and rhythm. Food stalls carried scents from nations I had only read about. Music spilled out of cafes. On that first night in New York, I stood by the single dusty window of my tiny rented room and looked at the city lights blinking against the horizon. "This is paradise," I murmured, my voice trembling with awe. But dreams like glass can crack. The first fracture came with money. I had known America would be expensive, but the reality stunned me. My rented room, barely large enough for a bed, a table, and a cupboard, cost more than my father earned in a month back home. Groceries drained my savings. Even a simple cup of coffee felt like a luxury. I began to realize survival here demanded more than ambition. It demanded sacrifice. So I found work at a cafe. At first, I told myself, it's just a cafe. How hard can it be? But the hours of standing wore down my feet until they throbbed with pain. Cleaning tables, scrubbing dishes, carrying trays for impatient customers. Every shift left my back aching, my hands smelling of soap and burnt coffee. By midnight, I often walked home through empty streets, the silence broken only by the echo of my own footsteps. It was on one of those nights that I saw him, a man sitting on the cold sidewalk, wrapped in an old blanket that barely covered him. His face was worn, the lines etched deep with fatigue. When he lifted his head and spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "Do you have $1? I'm hungry." I froze. Poverty was supposed to be a stranger here. Yet, in that moment, it stared me in the face. I reached into my pocket and found a few coins, hardly enough for myself, but I gave them anyway. He looked at me with tired eyes, and as he whispered, "God bless you," I felt something inside me shift. For the first time, I saw the shadow behind the glitter. I realized America, too, had those who slept on sidewalks, those who fought each day not for dreams but for survival. That night, as I lay awake in my small room, I understood something profound. The land of dreams was not without darkness. The promise of paradise was stitched together with threads of hardship. And I, a girl who had come chasing perfection, was about to learn what it meant to live in both light and shadow. The days in New York unfurled like pages of a book I wasn't sure I had learned to read. The ink was beautiful, but the meaning was sometimes harsh. After the shock of money, the second challenge emerged slowly, quietly, like a fog that creeps into your bones without warning. It was loneliness. In India, life had always been surrounded by voices. Our streets were never silent. Children's laughter blended with the call of vegetable sellers, with bells from the temple, with neighbors chatting over chai. Even in the smallest alley, someone was always near. Festivals painted the year with rhythm, Diwali lights, holy colors, Eid feasts. There was always a reason to gather, to share food, to share stories. Family was not just inside the home. It spilled into every corner of life. But here in America, silence filled the gaps between buildings. People walked quickly, eyes lowered or fixed on glowing screens. Conversations were short, clipped, efficient. Smiles felt rare, as though reserved for photographs, not strangers on the street. Some days I would walk through crowded sidewalks and still feel invisible, like a ghost moving among bodies that did not see me. I missed my mother's voice calling me for dinner, the smell of chapatis warming on the pan, the sound of my father's slippers shuffling across the floor. I missed my brother's jokes, foolish and endless, the kind that annoyed me at home but now seemed priceless treasures. Loneliness was not a sharp pain, but a slow ache, like a stone in the heart that grows heavier each day. At the university, I encountered a culture both exciting and intimidating. Professors encouraged us to speak loudly, to challenge ideas, to claim space in a room. Confidence was not suggested. It was demanded. One classmate once told me, almost casually, "You should be more confident. This is America." He meant well, perhaps, but his words lingered like a challenge. I smiled politely, yet inside I whispered to myself, confidence is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, unshakable. Still, I tried. I raised my hand, even when my voice trembled. I forced myself to join conversations, even when I felt like an outsider. It was exhausting, but also a kind of training. Like lifting weights, each attempt built a muscle I did not know I had. And then came winter. Back home, winter meant a cool breeze and shawls at night. Here it was an enemy. The cold cut through every layer of clothing. Streets turned white with snow, and my breath hung in the air like smoke. I remember one morning waking up with fever, my throat burning, my body shivering under thin blankets. I needed a doctor, but when I checked the cost without insurance, my heart sank. The bill was more than what I made in a week at the cafe. So I stayed in bed, drinking weak tea, slurping instant noodles, praying for my body to heal itself. For 3 days I lay there, alone in a city of millions, realizing how fragile survival could be. It was in those days of sickness that I opened my father's small packet for the first time. Inside was a folded photograph of our family. Smiling awkwardly, all of us squeezed together in front of our home. Tucked behind the photo was a note in his handwriting. "Wherever you are, this is your home, and we are with you." Tears blurred my vision as I held the paper to my chest. It was not medicine, but it gave me strength. By the time my fever broke, something inside me had changed. I had arrived in America expecting perfection, but illness stripped away that illusion. I began to see more clearly. The country was not heaven, nor was it hell. It was a place of both opportunity and cost, of brilliance and hardship. Walking to work after I recovered, I noticed the contrast everywhere. On one corner, a luxury store glittered with diamonds behind thick glass. Just steps away, a man slept on the sidewalk, newspapers tucked around his body against the cold. In the subway, I saw tired workers with eyes closed, clutching backpacks, and also young professionals with crisp suits and headphones, rushing to meetings. Rich and poor, dreamers and broken souls, they lived side by side, separated by invisible walls. Yet America was teaching me, not just English, not just academic theories, but resilience, independence. I learned how to budget down to the last coin, how to cook simple meals from discount groceries, how to walk home alone at midnight and keep my head high. I learned that survival itself was a kind of success, and perhaps that was the real lesson this land was offering me. Sometimes when I called home, my mother asked gently, "Are you happy there?" And I would hesitate. How could I explain? Happiness here was different. It was not constant, not easy. It flickered like a candle. Sometimes strong, sometimes almost extinguished, but always alive. On weekends, I found small comforts. I discovered an Indian grocery store miles away, and when I bought spices, turmeric, cumin, cardamom, the smell alone carried me back home. Cooking dal on a cold evening, I felt less like a stranger, more like myself. I made friends, slowly, carefully, other international students, some Americans too. We were all searching for connection, like stars trying to find a constellation in the vast night sky. Looking back, I realized that loneliness and hardship carved something into me. They hollowed out spaces that later filled with strength, with humility, with compassion. America was not the paradise I had once imagined on my rooftop in India, but perhaps it was never meant to be. Perhaps it was meant to be a mirror, showing me who I really was when stripped of comfort. And so, the dream was no longer simple. It was not just about skyscrapers and bright lights. It was about surviving storms, about finding light even in shadows, about learning that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. There's a saying I once heard, the first year in a foreign land teaches you more than 10 years at home. I didn't believe it until I lived through it. By the time spring returned to New York, I was no longer the same girl who had arrived months earlier with stars in her eyes. The glitter of Times Square still fascinated me, but it no longer blinded me. I had begun to see the city as it truly was, a place of contrasts, where every light created a shadow, where every success carried hidden sacrifices. Money remained a constant struggle. The cafe job paid just enough to cover rent and groceries, but not enough for luxuries. I learned to count every dollar as if it were a blessing. I walked instead of taking the subway, carried my own meals in a secondhand lunchbox, and wore the same coat day after day through the cold months. In India, I had dreamed of fashionable dresses and glossy handbags. In America, I was simply grateful for a warm jacket and shoes that did not leak in the snow. But what money could not buy, endurance often provided. Each night, as I dragged myself home with aching feet, I reminded myself, this is part of the journey. Nothing beautiful is born without pain. Yet pain came in other ways too. There were moments when the city's indifference pressed down on me so heavily that I felt as though I might vanish into its concrete walls. Crowds flowed around me like rivers around a stone. No one stopped. No one noticed. At first, I thought it was cruelty, but later I realized it was survival. In New York, people built invisible walls around themselves, not because they hated others, but because life demanded so much that they had little energy left to spare. Still, small acts of kindness shone through like cracks of light in the dark. Once on a snowy night, I stumbled while carrying grocery bags. My knees scraped the icy pavement, and tears of frustration filled my eyes. Just then, a woman I had never met helped me gather the scattered apples. She smiled softly and said, "Hang in there. New York is tough, but so are you." That moment, brief and fleeting, wore me more than the thickest coat. As weeks turned into months, I began noticing details I had overlooked before. The city was not only about money, loneliness, or hardship. It was also a place where millions of stories unfolded at once. I saw a street musician playing violin with eyes closed, lost in his own melody. I watched a mother hold her child's hand tightly while crossing a busy street, love written in every gesture. I noticed elderly men feeding pigeons in the park, their lives moving at a slower rhythm against the city's frantic pulse. These glimpses reminded me that dreams were not always grand. Sometimes they were simple: a warm cup of tea after work, a letter from home, a stranger's smile. But then came another lesson, one that tested me more deeply. It happened during final exams at the university. I had worked long shifts at the cafe, then spent nights studying until dawn. My body was exhausted, but I pushed forward. On the day of my hardest exam, I arrived late because the subway was delayed. My professor, strict and unbending, refused to grant me extra time. I scribbled answers with trembling hands, and when the grades arrived, I saw a mark far below what I had hoped for. I broke down in my small room, tears staining the paper spread before me. For the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Perhaps I was not strong enough. Perhaps America was not meant for me. The dream I had carried for years felt suddenly fragile, like glass slipping from my grasp. That night, I dialed home. My mother's voice reached me through the crackling line, steady and warm. I confessed everything: my exhaustion, my loneliness, my fear of failure. She listened silently, then said words I will never forget. "Alisia, remember, even the tallest tree was once a fragile sapling. It bent in storms but did not break. You are that tree. Do not give up now." Her words stitched my heart back together. I realized in that strength is not about never falling. It is about rising each time we do. With renewed determination, I studied harder, managed my hours with discipline, and sought help from classmates. Slowly, my grades improved. Slowly, my confidence grew. And through this struggle, I discovered something unexpected. My classmates, once intimidating, began to see me differently too. One invited me for coffee after class. Another shared notes when I missed a lecture. Bonds, fragile at first, began to form. We laughed over cultural misunderstandings, exchanged stories of home, and created tiny islands of belonging in a sea of strangers. It was during one of those gatherings that I learned an important truth. A fellow student from Brazil said, "Everyone thinks America is paradise, but here we are all fighting. Some for money, some for identity, some for family. You are not alone." His words resonated deeply. I realized my story was not unique. It was one of thousands, maybe millions. Every international student carried the same mixture of hope and struggle. We were bound together not by nationality, but by the courage to start over in a new world. From then on, I stopped asking whether America was perfect. Instead, I asked whether I was willing to grow through its imperfections. The answer, though difficult, was yes. By the end of my first year, I understood something I could never have known on my rooftop in India: that the real dream was not about skyscrapers or glamour. It was about discovering the resilience within myself. It was about learning that courage is built one day at a time, in tears as well as triumphs. The second year in America began with a kind of quiet acceptance. I had crossed the first winter, endured the storms of loneliness, and survived the disappointments that once threatened to break me. I was still young, only 23, but hardship has a way of aging the soul, of sharpening one's vision. By then, I no longer looked at New York with the eyes of a tourist dazzled by lights. I looked at it with the weary but determined gaze of someone who had learned that beauty is never free, and dreams always come with a price. Work at the cafe continued. My feet still ached at the end of long shifts, but I had learned the rhythm of the place. I no longer fumbled with trays, no longer trembled when customers shouted impatiently. My hands, once delicate from a life of books and notebooks, had grown calloused, the skin roughened by soap and hot water. Yet I wore those marks almost like medals, proof that I could endure, proof that I could bend without breaking. But survival alone cannot fill a heart. There were evenings when the weight of isolation pressed heavily. The city was vast, but friendships took time to blossom, and sometimes I wondered if the concrete walls had ears, for they seemed to echo my sighs back at me. On those nights, I would take out my father's photograph again, running my fingers over the faded smiles of my family. That small piece of paper reminded me that no matter how far I wandered, love still anchored me to the earth. It was during this period that I began to notice something curious. America was not only a place of work and study, it was also a place where contrasts collided in the open. On one hand, I saw a culture obsessed with success. Everywhere, people hurried as though racing against invisible clocks. Students aimed for prestigious internships. Workers dreamed of promotions. Neighbors boasted of new cars and vacations. Yet on the other hand, I saw exhaustion etched into their faces. I saw men and women collapsing into subway seats, their eyes heavy, their bodies slumped. I overheard conversations of debt, of rising rent, of broken marriages. It struck me then, the American dream was not a golden key handed freely to anyone who arrived. It was a maze. Some found their way, some got lost, some gave up, and in that maze, every step demanded sacrifice. Yet even amidst those sacrifices, moments of grace appeared. One afternoon, after a long shift, I stopped at a small park near my apartment. The cherry blossoms had begun to bloom, their pink petals trembling in the spring air. I sat on a bench, exhausted, but when the wind blew and petals scattered around me, I felt for the first time in months a sense of peace. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying across the park. An elderly couple strolled hand in hand, their steps slow but steady. In that simple scene, I was reminded that life, even in its harshest places, always leaves space for tenderness. My university classes became more demanding, but also more rewarding. I began to contribute in discussions, no longer silenced by shyness. Professors noticed my effort, and one of them, a woman with kind eyes, told me after class, "Your perspective matters. Never underestimate it." That sentence stayed with me. For so long, I had felt like a foreigner with little to offer. But slowly, I realized that my voice, shaped by my homeland and my struggles, carried a uniqueness no one else could bring. Of course, not every day was filled with encouragement. There were still cold stares when I spoke with an accent, still moments when I felt smaller than the skyscrapers that towered above me. But the difference now was this. I no longer let those moments define me. I carried my mother's words in my heart, that even the tallest tree had once been fragile. I chose to believe that my roots were growing, even if they were hidden beneath the soil. It was also in my second year that I encountered poverty more directly. While volunteering at a community kitchen, an activity suggested by one of my classmates, I served food to people who lined up in silence, their clothes worn, their eyes weary. Some were immigrants like me, others were veterans, others were families with children. As I ladled soup into bowls, I realized that hunger and hardship did not discriminate. They crossed boundaries of race, gender, and background. In those faces, I saw reflections of my own fear, the fear of not belonging, the fear of being forgotten. That experience humbled me. Back home, I had believed America to be flawless. Now, standing behind a counter, handing out meals to those who have been abandoned by fortune, I saw that the land of dreams was also a land of struggle. Yet strangely, it did not make me bitter. It made me grateful for my small room, for my cafe wages, for my education. It made me realize that survival itself was a privilege many were denied. Loneliness still visited me, but it no longer consumed me. I began to write letters to myself, small notes of encouragement, and pin them above my desk. Sentences like, "You are stronger than yesterday," or "This struggle is shaping you." It may sound foolish, but in the silence of my room, those words gave me comfort. Looking back, I can see that my second year was less about discovery and more about endurance. The first year had stripped away illusions, but the second built in me a kind of quiet strength. I no longer asked if America was perfect. I no longer expected it to be. Instead, I asked whether I could grow in this soil, even if it was rocky. And the answer, slowly, was yes. By the end of that year, When I stood once more at my window looking at the city lights, I did not whisper paradise. Instead, I whispered, "This is life, messy, painful, beautiful, and mine." There's a strange truth about time in a foreign land. It feels both fast and slow. Days at the cafe stretched endlessly, each hour marked by the rhythm of orders and dishes. Yet months slipped past like shadows. Suddenly, I realized I'd been in New York long enough to stop marveling at the subway map, long enough to know which streets glowed with light at midnight, and which ones turned dangerous after dark. I was no longer a newcomer, though I still felt like a wanderer. By then, my studies demanded more of me than ever. Assignments grew heavier, research papers piled up, and professors expected excellence as though it were ordinary. There were nights when I sat at my desk until dawn, the window framing a city that never slept, my lamp burning beside me as my pen scratched across pages. Coffee became my companion, and exhaustion my shadow. One evening, after submitting a particularly difficult paper, I collapsed on my bed, too tired even to remove my shoes. I remember staring at the ceiling and wondering, why am I here? The dream that had carried me from my small town in India now felt like a heavy burden. What was I chasing? A degree? A job? Respect? Or was I simply trying to prove to myself that I belonged in this vast world? It was during those reflections that I began to see the cracks not only in my dream, but in others. A friend of mine, also an international student, confided that she was working 3 jobs just to cover tuition. Another admitted he hadn't spoken to his parents in weeks because he couldn't afford the phone bills. Their stories echoed mine, though each was unique. We were all travelers carrying invisible weights, smiling in public but crying in private. And yet, amidst all of this, there was also growth. I discovered a resilience I had never known. I learned how to live on little, how to stretch a meal across 3 days, how to find joy in small victories. Once, I found a library book that reminded me of my childhood in India. Its pages smelled of ink and dust, and for a moment, I was transported back to warm evenings under flickering lantern light. That simple memory became a treasure, a reminder that even in hardship, beauty survives. The city continued to reveal its contrasts. One morning, while walking to class, I passed a homeless man sitting against the wall of a glittering bank. His clothes were torn, his hands shaking from the cold. Behind him, inside the glass, businessmen in suits moved with polished confidence. The image seared into my mind, wealth and despair separated by a single pane of glass. I wonder how many people noticed the man, or if he had become invisible, like a ghost haunting the city's corners. At the cafe, I saw a similar contrast. A woman once ordered a latte and left a $5 tip, her nails gleaming, her perfume expensive. Later that same evening, a tired worker came in, counting coins carefully before ordering the cheapest coffee on the menu. Both left through the same door into the same city, yet their worlds could not have been further apart. These observations changed me. I began to ask myself, what does it mean to chase a dream? Is it to accumulate wealth, to wear fine clothes, or is it to endure hardship and still find reasons to hope? The answers were not clear, but the question stayed with me, shaping the way I looked at everything. Winter returned, harsher than the last. Snow piled high. The wind cut like knives, and my coat seemed thinner than ever. But unlike the first year, I did not feel defeated. I had learned how to face the cold, with scarves wrapped tightly, with warm tea in my hands, with determination in my chest. Survival had become routine, no longer extraordinary. It was during that second winter that I began writing in a journal. Each night, I poured my thoughts onto paper. Memories of home, struggles at work, quiet victories in class, fears I could not share with anyone else. The pages became a friend, one that listened without judgment. In those writings, I discovered a voice inside me, tender yet strong, and I began to understand something important. Stories keep us alive. My story, though ordinary, mattered. It gave shape to my pain. It gave meaning to my endurance. And perhaps that is what kept me moving forward. The belief that my journey was not in vain, that every step, every tear, every sacrifice was part of something larger, Sometimes, when I stood by the window of my small room and looked out at the endless lights of New York, I imagined my younger self, the girl on the rooftop in India, staring at the stars. She had dreamed of paradise, of a life without sorrow. I wished I could whisper to her, "Paradise is not a place, child. It is the strength you find within yourself. It is the courage to continue, even when the world feels cold." By the end of that winter, I was no longer chasing the same dream I had carried across oceans. I was building a new one forged from resilience, humility, and a quiet understanding that life is both shadow and light. Spring arrived again, and with it came a sense of renewal. The city thawed. Snow melted into puddles, and the trees that had stood barren through the harsh winter began to show the first shy buds of green. For the first time in months, I felt warmth on my skin as the sunlight filtered through tall buildings. People seemed lighter too. They filled the parks, jogged along the riverside, laughed at street corners. It was as though New York itself had taken a long, deep breath after surviving the cold. By now, I had learned to walk with steadier steps. The girl who once trembled at the sound of impatient customers or sat silently in class now carried herself differently. My accent was still thick, my roots still visible, but I no longer felt the need to hide them. I realized that every person in the city had come from somewhere, carrying their own histories, their own scars. I was no longer ashamed of mine. At the cafe, I had grown close to a few co-workers. One of them, an older woman named Maria, had worked there for over a decade. She told me stories of her childhood in Puerto Rico, of her first years in America, of raising children while scrubbing tables and brewing coffee. Her laugh was deep, her eyes lined with years of labor, but her spirit was unbroken. She once told me, "Alisia, life here is like this coffee we serve. It's bitter sometimes, but strong enough to keep you going." Her words stayed with me, wrapping themselves around my heart like protective charm. There were still difficult days, of course. Days when assignments piled higher than my energy, when money seemed too thin, when loneliness returned like an unwelcome guest. But there were also days when life surprised me with joy. I remember one particular afternoon when I received a letter from my younger brother. In messy handwriting, he described how he had passed an important exam, how he missed my cooking, how he kept my old books stacked neatly in my room. Enclosed in the envelope was a pressed flower from our garden back home. When I held it between my fingers, fragile yet enduring, I cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of connection across oceans. These small gestures reminded me that even when we feel far from home, love travels. It does not need visas. It does not need passports. It finds its way. My studies, though demanding, also offered moments of revelation. In one class, we discussed literature about migration and displacement. As I read stories of others who had crossed borders in search of better lives, I felt my own heart reflected on the page. I was not alone. My struggle was not unique. Generations before me had walked similar roads, carrying the same mixture of hope and hardship. Their resilience gave me courage. Their stories whispered that survival was possible. And then something happened that shifted my understanding even further. One evening, while closing the cafe, a young man walked in just before we locked the doors. He was tall, his clothes shabby, his face pale from exhaustion. He asked softly if there was any leftover food. My manager hesitated, but I quickly offered him a sandwich that would have been thrown away. He looked at me with eyes full of gratitude, and in that moment, I remembered the first homeless man I had met months earlier, the one who had asked for $1 on the sidewalk. That memory collided with the present, and I felt a deep ache in my chest. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of how thin the line was between comfort and despair, how a single twist of fate could place any of us on either side of that line. I thought of my own fragile balance, how close I had come to breaking when sickness struck, how vulnerable I still was in this land of opportunity. And yet, rather than frightening me, the thought filled me with compassion. It reminded me that every human being carries battles invisible to others. From then on, I began to look at people differently. On the subway, in classrooms, on the street, I wondered about their unseen stories. The woman in heels rushing to a meeting, Was she sending money to family overseas? The old man feeding pigeons. Did he once cross an ocean, chasing a dream like mine? The child holding a parent's hand. Would they grow up with struggles similar to mine, or easier or harder? New York, I realized, was not just a city of lights and shadows. It was a living book, each person a chapter, each face a page. And I too was a character, writing my part with every step I took. By summer, I began to feel something unexpected. Belonging, not the kind that erases who you are, but the kind that weaves your story into the greater fabric of a place. I would walk through the streets and feel less like an outsider, more like a thread in the vast tapestry of the city. I no longer whispered paradise at night. Instead, I whispered home, not because it was perfect, but because it was where I had learned who I truly was. By the time the season circled once more, I had begun to understand that dreams are not destinations. They are journeys. They stretch, they bend, they evolve with every experience. The dream that had once pulled me across oceans had changed its shape, just as I had changed mine. The cafe was no longer just a place of work. It had become a stage where human stories unfolded daily. I saw young couples whispering their futures over cappuccinos, exhausted workers refueling with bitter black coffee, lonely souls lingering over empty cups because they had nowhere else to go. Each interaction reminded me of how deeply people needed connection, even in a city where everyone seemed too busy to pause. One evening, an older gentleman sat at a corner table, staring out the window as rain streaked down the glass. I approached to clear his cup, and he said quietly, "I used to sit here with my wife. She passed away last year. Now I come to remember." His words hung in the air, heavy with love and loss. I sat for a moment, breaking the cafe's rules, and listened as he told me about their life together, how they had met in the 1960s, how they had struggled in their own youth, how they had built a family. His story moved me more than any movie ever could. It reminded me that survival was not enough. What mattered was the love we carried through survival. Meanwhile, my university journey pressed on. I had grown more confident, not because I had conquered fear, but because I had learned to live with it. Presentations that once terrified me became opportunities to share my voice. Professors who had seemed distant now respected me for my persistence. I began to believe that my struggles were not weaknesses, but strengths in disguise. But alongside progress, there were still moments of despair. Bills piled high, and some months I feared I would not have enough to pay rent. Once, I worked 3 consecutive double shifts, returning home so exhausted that I fell asleep with my shoes still on. The next morning, I woke with tears streaming down my face, though I hadn't realized I was crying. Those were the days that tested me the most, the days when silence felt heavier than sound, when the city seemed to close its arms rather than open them. In those moments, I often thought of my parents, my father, who had given me the photograph and note, my mother, whose voice across the crackling phone lines always carried hope. I imagined them sitting at our kitchen table back home, speaking softly about me, perhaps worrying whether their daughter was eating well, whether she was safe. Their love reached me across oceans, invisible but powerful. It became my anchor. Slowly, I found a way to give back. I continued volunteering at the community kitchen. At first, I had joined to distract myself from loneliness, but it grew into something deeper. I saw faces there that mirrored my own pain, immigrants, veterans, single mothers. Serving them food, listening to their stories, I realized that compassion was a form of wealth greater than any dollar. Some of the people I met had lost everything, yet they still laughed, still thanked us, still carried dignity in their eyes. From them, I learned humility. One night, as I left the kitchen, a woman touched my arm and said, "Thank you, not just for the food, but for seeing me." Her words pierced me. I understood then that in a world obsessed with speed and success, sometimes the greatest gift is simply to acknowledge another's existence. The city continued to be a paradox. There were days when I stood in awe of its beauty, the skyline at dusk, the music of street performers, the sudden kindness of strangers. And there were days when I cursed its hardness, its indifference, its relentless demand for money and strength. But through it all, I began to see that life itself is a paradox. Joy and sorrow are not opposites. They are companions. I started to notice something else, too. With each passing month, I no longer felt like a guest in New York. The rhythms of the city had carved themselves into me. The roar of the subway no longer startled me. The rush of traffic became background music. Even the bitter winter air felt familiar. I realized that belonging does not come from perfection. It comes from persistence. If you stay long enough, if you endure, a place eventually opens its heart to you. And perhaps the same is true of people. Slowly, friendships deepened. My classmates became more than acquaintances. We shared meals, celebrated small victories, comforted each other in failures. Together, we created a fragile but real family, stitched together not by blood, but by shared struggle. Looking back, I saw how far I had come from the rooftop in India where I once dreamed of skyscrapers. The dream had changed, yes, but it had not died. It had matured, like a child growing into adulthood. The little girl who had imagined perfection would not recognize the woman I had become, but she would be proud. One night, standing again by my window, I whispered into the dark, "America is not perfect and neither am I, but we are both alive, both flawed, both beautiful in ways no magazine picture could capture." As the years unfolded, I came to understand something that no one had told me back in India. Survival in a foreign land is not just about money or work. It is about spirit. The body can grow tired, but if the spirit remains strong, then even in the darkest nights, a small light shines within. By then, I had lived long enough in New York to see the seasons circle more than once. Each carried its lessons. Summers brought energy, with streets alive in color and music. Autumn draped the city in golden leaves, reminding me that beauty can exist even in letting go. Winters tested me, sharpening my resilience against both cold and solitude. And springs reminded me that renewal is always possible, even after the harshest storms. The cafe continued to be my daily battlefield and classroom. One day, a customer scolded me angrily because I had mixed up her order. The old me might have cried in the back room, but instead, I apologized calmly, fixed a mistake, and moved on. Later, one of my co-workers whispered, "You're stronger than you look." I smiled, because I knew now that strength had little to do with appearance. It was built quietly, through every challenge survived. University, too, demanded more of me. My courses grew complex, requiring long hours in the library. Yet with every paper I wrote, every discussion I joined, I felt myself expanding. I was no longer just a girl from a small town. I was a thinker, a participant in global conversations. Even if my voice shook, I spoke anyway, and with each attempt, my words carried more weight. But hardship had not disappeared. There were still nights when the silence of my room pressed too heavily on me. On those nights, I would cook meals from home, dal simmering slowly, chapatis puffing on the pan. The scent filled the apartment, wrapping me in memory. I would eat alone, but in my mind, I could almost hear my mother's laughter, my brother's chatter. In that way, food became a bridge, carrying me across oceans back to the warmth of home. It was also during this time that I began to notice the quieter lessons America offered. Not the loud promises of success, but the subtle truths whispered through everyday encounters. Once, while waiting for the subway, I saw a blind man tapping his cane, moving carefully down the platform. People parted to let him pass, and one young woman guided him gently to a bench. No one applauded her. No cameras captured it. Yet it was in these unspoken acts of kindness that I found hope. For every moment of cruelty, there existed a moment of compassion. The world was always both. Another day, I overheard a father speaking to his little daughter as they crossed the street. She asked him why some people slept outside on cardboard. He knelt down and explained softly, "Sometimes life is harder for some people, but we can always share what we have." His words struck me like a bell. I thought of the homeless man I had once given change to, of the young man who had asked for leftover food at the cafe. And I realized that even in a land of wealth, the true measure of humanity lay in how we treated those with nothing. By then, I had stopped comparing America to the images from magazines or movies. I no longer sought paradise. Instead, I sought meaning. I asked myself each morning, What can I learn today? Whom can I help? How can I endure with dignity? These questions gave me purpose when the dream itself felt too distant. Friendships deepened further. I found comfort in the company of other students who, like me, carried two worlds on their shoulders. We shared food from our homelands, celebrated festivals together in small apartments, and laughed over the mistakes we made navigating this strange new culture. Once, during Diwali, I lit a single candle on my windowsill. My friends came over with sweets, and for a moment, my tiny room glowed with warmth. Outside, the city roared with traffic, but inside, it was filled with the spirit of home. There were also friendships with Americans who taught me new ways of seeing. One friend once told me, "You know, Alisia, we envy you." I was surprised. "Why?" I asked. She smiled. "Because you have courage. You left everything to start anew. Most of us have never done that." Her words turned something inside me. I had always thought of myself as weaker, struggling to catch up, but perhaps courage was not measured by perfection. Perhaps it was measured by the willingness to take the first step into the unknown. As the semesters passed, I grew more aware of my own transformation. The girl who had once whispered dreams to the stars had become a woman learning to face reality with steady eyes. And yet, the dream was not dead. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer about living in a perfect city or wearing elegant clothes. It was about carrying hope through hardship, about finding beauty in imperfection, about learning that strength is born not from ease, but from endurance. On the night before another new year, I stood at my window again, watching fireworks scatter across the sky. The colors burst brightly, then faded into smoke. It struck me that life is the same, moment of brightness, moments of fading, always fleeting, always precious. I pressed my forehead against the glass and whispered, "I came here chasing paradise." What I found was reality. And reality, though harder, is also richer. The third year carried with it a different kind of weight. It was no longer the shock of newness or the ache of loneliness. It was a deep, quiet fatigue of endurance. By now, I had adjusted to the rhythms of America. The city no longer overwhelmed me as it once did. Instead, it demanded from me a kind of loyalty, as if to say, if you want to stay, you must keep proving yourself day after day. At the cafe, I had become one of the more experienced workers. New employees looked to me for guidance. I showed them how to handle the coffee machines, how to stay calm when customers grew angry, how to move quickly without stumbling. It felt strange, almost ironic, to realize I had gone from the shy newcomer fumbling with trays to someone others trusted for advice. Growth often comes silently, without our noticing, until one day we look back and see how far we have traveled. Still, the challenges were relentless. Tuition fees loomed like heavy clouds, and my hours at work increased just to keep pace. There were days when I barely slept, studying in the morning, working in the afternoon, writing essays through the night. My body protested, but my willpower pushed forward. I reminded myself of my parents, of their sacrifices, of the faith they had placed in me. Giving up was never an option. One night, after another exhausting double shift, I walked home through quiet streets. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, the pavement glistening under streetlights. As I turned a corner, I saw a group of men huddled beneath an overpass, blankets wrapped tightly around them. Their faces were hidden, but I could hear their low voices, their laughter even. It struck me that even in poverty, even in the hardest circumstances, people found ways to laugh, to cling to fragments of humanity. That sight humbled me. My struggles, though heavy, were still accompanied by opportunities. Education, a roof, the chance to build something. Theirs were struggles without end. At the university, I faced another test. I had been chosen to present a research paper at a small conference. When my professor first suggested it, I panicked. Me, standing in front of strangers, speaking with my accented English, daring to claim knowledge? My first instinct was to refuse. But then I remember my mother's words about the sapling becoming a tree, about storms shaping rather than destroying. So I agreed. The day of the presentation, my hands trembled and my throat felt dry. Yet as I began to speak, something shifted. The room quieted, and people leaned forward to listen. I realized that my story, my perspective mattered, not because it was flawless, but because it was mine. When I finished, polite applause filled the room. A few attendees even approached me afterward to ask questions. I walked out into the cool evening air with a heart that felt lighter than it had in months. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Confidence is not about never doubting. It is about standing even when the doubt is heavy." Slowly, I began to build dreams not of perfection, but of possibility. I dreamed of finishing my studies, of perhaps finding a job that would allow me to support my family back home, of one day creating a home of my own. These dreams were smaller than the grand fantasies of skyscrapers and glamour I once held, but they were also sturdier, rooted in reality. Yet even as my personal journey continued, the city kept reminding me of its duality. I saw celebrations on one side, parades, concerts, dazzling lights, and despair on the other, silent figures on sidewalks, hungry eyes, weary faces. America was never just one story. It was millions woven together, some triumphant, some tragic. And I, too, was one thread in that tapestry. It was during this time that I also began to notice how America was changing me in ways I hadn't expected. Back in India, I had relied so much on family and community. Here, I learned independence, but also responsibility. I learned how to stand alone, yes, but also how to reach out when others needed help. I discovered that resilience was not just about surviving your own battles. It was about offering strength to others when theirs faltered. One evening, after class, I found myself sitting in the library with a group of fellow students from different countries: Brazil, China, Nigeria, Mexico. We shared stories of our homes, laughed at cultural misunderstandings, and spoke of the dreams that had brought us here. In that circle, I realized something profound. Though we came from different lands, our struggles were alike. Loneliness, hard work, sacrifice, hope. These were the languages we all understood. Looking around that table, I thought of the little girl on the rooftop in India, staring at the stars, believing that America held only happiness. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her, America has light, yes, but it also has darkness. There are dreams, but they demand a price. There is freedom, but it is never without burden. And perhaps that is the truth of life itself, not just America. No place is perfect. No journey is without pain. What matters is the heart you carry through it all. By the end of that year, I had stopped asking, is America the land of dreams? Instead, I asked, am I strong enough to keep dreaming even here? The answer, though whispered, was yes. The closer I came to finishing my studies, the more I began to reflect on what this journey had meant. America was no longer just a country on a map, no longer just a fantasy born of magazine pictures. It was a teacher, stern, unrelenting, but also transformative. It had stripped away my illusions, tested me with hardship, and revealed to me strengths I never knew I had. At the cafe, I continued working until my very last semester. By then, I was no longer the timid girl hiding behind the counter. I was someone who could handle rush hours, deal with angry customers, and still smile at the end of a long night. My co-workers had become a kind of family. Maria, with her wisdom, still reminded me that life, like coffee, is bitter but strong. A younger co-worker once told me, when you leave this place, they'll miss you more than you think. His words touched me, for I had often believed I was invisible. At the university, professors who once seemed distant now greeted me warmly. They had seen my growth, seen my persistence. One told me, you've shown that courage is not about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about refusing to stay silent when it matters. I carried that compliment with me like a medal, not for pride, but for reassurance that my efforts had been seen. Yet, even as achievements came, the reality of America's dual nature never left me. Walking home one night, I passed by the same corner where months earlier I had met a homeless man asking for $1. He was still there, though thinner, wrapped in the same worn blanket. The sight reminded me that while I had grown, while I had found footholds, many others remained trapped in cycles without escape. Dreams were possible here, yes, but they were not given equally. That truth humbled me. It also reminded me of why I came, not just for myself, But for my family, my parents' sacrifices had carried me across oceans. Their faith had kept me steady when I nearly fell. I thought of my father's note, still tucked safely in my drawer. Wherever you are, this is your home, and we are with you. Those words had healed me in moments of despair, and they continue to remind me that success was never mine alone. It was shared with those who had believed in me from the beginning. As graduation approached, I walked across the campus, trees heavy with spring blossoms, students buzzing with excitement. For many, it was the end of a chapter, but for me, it was also proof that I had endured, proof that even through loneliness, poverty, exhaustion, and fear, I had not broken. The ceremony itself felt like a dream. Dressed in cap and gown, I sat among hundreds of students, each carrying their own story. When my name was called, I walked across the stage, my heart pounding. I could not see my parents in the crowd. They were thousands of miles away, but I imagined their faces, their smiles, their tears. I imagined my mother whispering a prayer, my father standing silently, proud. And in that moment, I knew I had fulfilled at least part of the promise I made when I left home. I'll make you proud. Afterward, as I held my diploma, I realized something profound. The real dream was never about living in a perfect city, never about being rich or glamorous. It was about courage. Courage to leave home, courage to face hardship, courage to continue even when the path was unclear. And that courage, once awakened, could never be taken away. When people now ask me, is America as perfect as in the movies? I smile. I tell them, America has light, but it also has darkness. There are dreams, but there are struggles too. If you are strong, if you are willing to work hard, you will find your place. But do not expect magic. Expect reality. And within reality, expect to find yourself. Because in the end, that is what this journey gave me. Not a paradise, but a mirror. It showed me who I truly was. It taught me that the real dream is not about where you live, but how you live, with hope, with courage, with an open heart. And perhaps my story is not mine alone. It is the story of thousands, maybe millions, who crossed oceans chasing visions of paradise, only to find something far more complicated, far more painful, but also far more beautiful. My name is Alisia. I came to America chasing a dream. What I found was both beauty and pain. And I learned that even in the harshest places, life offers grace to those who endure. That is my story, and perhaps in some way, it is yours too.